An arrogant billionaire mocked a waitress for speaking broken English at his own exclusive restaurant. He humiliated her in front of wealthy guests, made cruel jokes about her accent, and treated her like she was worthless. But when a critical business deal with French investors was about to collapse, what this waitress said in perfect, flawless French didn't just save his billion-dollar deal. It shattered every assumption he'd ever made about worth, intelligence, and the people he'd spent his life looking down on. This is Alexander Stone's story, and the truth about Emma Rodriguez that changed everything. A story that begins not with respect or kindness, but with cruelty, prejudice, and a man who was about to learn the hardest lesson of his privileged life. Before we start the story, leave a comment below and tell us what city you're watching from. We love seeing our Deep Stories community growing all around the world, and at the end of this story, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Let us know what you think. If you believe that a person's worth has nothing to do with their accent or background, that intelligence comes in many forms, and that the people we underestimate are sometimes the ones who will save us, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is Alexander Stone's journey, a story about an arrogant billionaire who mocked a waitress, and what she said in perfect French that left him absolutely speechless. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to the day Emma Rodriguez walked into Stone's restaurant with a dream and a secret, and the day Alexander Stone made the biggest mistake of his life. Let's begin. Alexander Stone stood in his flagship restaurant, Stone's, surveying his empire with the satisfaction of a man who'd never been told no. At 42 years old, he was worth $3.7 billion, owned 15 restaurants across major cities, and had built his fortune on the simple principle that excellence was everything and mediocrity deserved nothing. His restaurants catered to the ultra-wealthy, the kind of people who thought nothing of spending $5,000 on a single meal. Everything in Stone's was perfect. The crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's houses, the imported Italian marble floors, the 18-karat gold flatware. Even the staff were chosen not just for their skills, but for how they looked, how they moved, how well they fit into the aesthetic of wealth and power that Alexander had spent 20 years building. That Thursday evening in late September, Alexander was preparing for one of the most important nights of his business career. Pierre Dubois and his investment consortium from Paris were flying in specifically to dine at Stone's before committing to a $200 million deal that would expand Alexander's restaurant empire across Europe. Everything had to be absolutely perfect, which is why, when he saw the new waitress struggling with a tray of champagne glasses near table 7, his blood pressure immediately spiked. She was young, maybe late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in the regulation style. But there was something about the way she moved, hesitant and uncertain, that screamed inexperience. Alexander didn't recognize her, which meant she was new, which meant she shouldn't have been working the main floor on a night this crucial. Marcus, his head waiter of 15 years, appeared at his elbow. Marcus was one of the few people Alexander truly trusted. A man who understood that perfection wasn't just a goal, but a non-negotiable requirement. "The new girl," Alexander said quietly, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Emma Rodriguez. She started 3 days ago. One of the regular waitresses called in sick, and we were short-staffed. She's been working the back sections, learning the ropes. I thought she could handle some of the simpler tables tonight." Alexander's jaw clenched. "You thought wrong. Look at her. She can barely carry a tray without looking like she's about to drop it. And did you hear her trying to explain the wine list to table 4? Her English is terrible. She sounds like she just got off the boat." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "She's still learning. Her references were excellent. She has a degree in economics and—" "I don't care if she has a degree in astrophysics," Alexander cut him off. "This is Stone's. We don't hire people who can't speak proper English. We don't put incompetent staff on the floor during the most important night of the quarter. Fix this, now." Emma Rodriguez stood near the kitchen entrance, her hands trembling slightly as she reviewed her order pad. She'd felt Alexander Stone's eyes on her all evening, watching her every move with the kind of cold assessment that made her skin crawl. She knew what he saw when he looked at her. Just another immigrant trying to make it in America. Someone whose accent marked her as less than, someone who didn't belong in his world of crystal and gold. If only he knew the truth. If only any of them knew. Emma had 5 degrees from 3 different countries. She spoke 6 languages fluently. Spanish, her native tongue, English, which she'd perfected during her years at Harvard, French, from her time at the Sorbonne, Italian, from her doctoral research in Milan, Mandarin, from a year teaching in Beijing, and Portuguese, which she'd learned from her Brazilian grandmother. She had a PhD in international economics from Harvard, a master's degree from the London School of Economics, and had worked as a senior analyst at the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C. for 3 years. 3 months ago, she'd been on track to become the youngest woman ever promoted to director level at the IMF. But then her mother had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. Emma's father had died when she was 16, and her mother was all she had left. The treatments weren't covered by insurance. The experimental therapy that might save her life cost $300,000. Emma had savings, but not nearly enough. She'd taken out loans, sold everything she owned, and when that still wasn't enough, she'd done something she never thought she'd do. She'd taken a leave of absence from her prestigious career to work 3 jobs. During the day, she taught economics online to international students. In the evenings, she tutored the teenage children of wealthy executives in math and science. And at night, she worked at Stone's, serving people who looked at her like she was invisible, like she was nothing more than a servant. The money was decent, especially with tips. But more than that, it gave her something to focus on besides the terror that woke her up at 3 in the morning, the knowledge that her mother was dying and there was nothing Emma could do to stop it except keep working, keep earning, keep fighting for every dollar that might buy one more day, one more week, one more chance. She'd kept her accent deliberately broken, her English intentionally simple. It was easier that way. People didn't ask questions. They didn't try to make conversation or get to know her. They left her alone to do her job and collect her tips and go home to her tiny studio apartment where she'd sit with her laptop and her mother's medical bills and try to figure out how to make impossible numbers add up to hope. Alexander Stone had no idea that the waitress he was glaring at with such disdain could explain macroeconomic theory in 6 languages. That she'd advised governments on currency stabilization. That she'd published papers in academic journals that he probably couldn't even understand. And Emma preferred it that way. She didn't need his approval or his respect. She just needed his money. The tips at Stone's were some of the best in the city. She could endure his contempt as long as the checks kept clearing. The evening continued, and with each passing hour, Alexander's frustration grew. Emma seemed to be everywhere he didn't want her to be. When she approached table 12, he watched as she struggled to pronounce the chef's special, ease the pan-seared duck breast with the, the cherry reduction, and one of the men at the table, a hedge fund manager Alexander recognized, interrupted her with a laugh. Just bring us whatever the chef recommends, sweetheart. Don't hurt yourself trying to read the big words. The table erupted in laughter. Emma's cheeks flushed red, but she nodded and hurried away. Alexander watched her go, a cold satisfaction settling in his chest. Maybe now Marcus would understand why he insisted on such strict hiring standards. This was exactly the kind of embarrassment that could damage Stone's reputation. When Emma delivered water glasses to table 8 and accidentally brushed against one of the guests with her sleeve, the woman looked at her like she was contaminated. "Watch where you're going," the woman snapped. "This dress costs more than you make in a year." Emma apologized profusely in her broken English, backing away with the kind of subservient posture that Alexander found both appropriate and somehow irritating at the same time. By 9:30, Pierre Dubois and his consortium had arrived. Alexander greeted them personally, his French rusty but serviceable. "Bonsoir, Monsieur Dubois. Welcome to Stone's. We are honored by your presence. Pierre, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, smiled warmly. Monsieur Stone, your reputation precedes you. We are eager to experience this famous American hospitality and cuisine. Alexander guided them to the private dining room he'd prepared, a space that showcased the best of Stone's design aesthetic. Every detail had been carefully considered. The lighting, the flowers, the table settings, even the temperature had been calibrated to create the perfect atmosphere for closing the deal that would change his life. As the dinner progressed, Alexander began to relax. The food was impeccable. The service, with Marcus personally overseeing every course, was flawless. Pierre and his colleagues seemed genuinely impressed. They discussed the deal casually between courses, and Alexander could feel the momentum building, that electric sense that comes when success is within reach. Then, midway through the main course, Pierre leaned back in his chair and switched from English to rapid French. Jean, qu'en penses-tu? Ces Américains comprennent-ils vraiment le marché européen? What do you think, Jean? Do these Americans truly understand the European market? Alexander's smile froze on his face. His French was good enough for pleasantries, but Pierre was speaking quickly, using colloquial expressions and business terminology that was beyond Alexander's vocabulary. Jean, a younger man with sharp features, responded in equally rapid French. Je ne sais pas. Stone semble compétent. Mais nous avons besoin de quelqu'un qui comprend vraiment les nuances culturelles. Les Américains ont tendance à être trop, comment dire, agressifs dans leur approche. I don't know. Stone seems competent, but we need someone who truly understands cultural nuances. Americans tend to be too, how to say, aggressive in their approach. Alexander felt sweat beginning to form at his hairline. They were discussing the deal, possibly having second thoughts, and he couldn't understand enough to respond properly. He'd been so focused on the food and the ambiance that he'd failed to ensure proper translation services would be available. His translator, Sophie, was supposed to be here an hour ago, but she'd texted to say she was stuck in traffic from the airport. Marie, the third member of the consortium, chimed in with her own concerns in French. Et le contrat? Les termes ne sont pas tout à fait ce que nous avions discuté à Paris, particulièrement la clause sur la propriété intellectuelle et les pourcentages de partage des profits. And the contract? The terms aren't quite what we discussed in Paris, particularly the clause about intellectual property and profit-sharing percentages. Alexander felt panic rising in his chest. They were discussing specific contract terms, and he was catching maybe one word in 5. This was a disaster. $200 million was slipping through his fingers because he couldn't speak French fluently enough to address their concerns in real time. Pierre looked at him expectantly, clearly waiting for a response to something that had just been said. Alexander smiled, trying to buy time. I apologize. My French is not as strong as I'd like. My translator should be here shortly to... Your translator. Pierre's expression shifted slightly, a hint of disappointment crossing his aristocratic features. Monsieur Stone, in Europe, we prefer to do business with people who understand our language, our culture. A translator creates distance, formality. We wanted to feel a connection tonight. The air in the private dining room grew heavy with unspoken judgment. Alexander could feel the deal dying right in front of him, could see the polite withdrawal in Pierre's eyes. 20 years of building an empire, and it was about to crumble because of a language barrier he'd never bothered to properly address. In desperation, his mind raced through options. He could call Michael, his business partner, but Michael's French was worse than his own. He could try to stall longer, hope Sophie arrived in time, but he could see the consortium members exchanging glances. Their body language already shifting toward departure. The men were beginning to stand, making polite noises about jet lag and early meetings. Perhaps we should continue this discussion tomorrow, Pierre said gently, which Alexander knew was code for the deal is off. Just then, Emma appeared at the doorway with their dessert course. She'd been assigned to assist Marcus tonight since they were short-staffed. Alexander barely glanced at her as she began setting down plates of the chef's signature chocolate soufflé. But Pierre, ever the gentleman, smiled at her warmly. "Merci, mademoiselle." And Emma, without thinking, responded in perfect, fluent French. "Je vous en prie, monsieur. Le soufflé est préparé avec du chocolat belge et une touche de fleur de sel. Le chef recommande de le déguster immédiatement tant qu'il est encore chaud." "You're welcome, sir. The soufflé is prepared with Belgian chocolate and a touch of fleur de sel. The chef recommends enjoying it immediately while it's still warm." The room went completely silent. Emma froze, realizing what she'd just done. She'd been so lost in the rhythm of service, so automatic in her responses, that she'd forgotten to maintain her facade of broken English. Pierre's eyebrows shot up in surprised delight. "Vous parlez français? You speak French?" Emma's heart hammered in her chest. She could feel Alexander's eyes boring into her with an intensity that made her want to disappear. But there was no taking it back now. She nodded slowly. "Oui, monsieur. Je parle français." "Yes, sir. I speak French." Jean leaned forward, his expression shifting from skepticism to interest. "Votre accent est excellent. Où avez-vous appris?" "Your accent is excellent. Where did you learn?" Emma hesitated, glancing at Alexander, who looked like he'd been struck by lightning. When she spoke again, it was in the flowing, cultured French she'd perfected during her 2 years at the Sorbonne. "J'ai étudié à la Sorbonne pendant 2 ans. J'ai également travaillé au Fonds monétaire international à Washington pendant 3 ans, où je traitais principalement avec des délégations francophones. I studied at the Sorbonne for 2 years. I also worked at the International Monetary Fund in Washington for 3 years, where I dealt primarily with French-speaking delegations." Marie's eyes widened. "Le FMI? Vous avez travaillé au Fonds monétaire international? The IMF? You worked at the International Monetary Fund?" Emma nodded, fully committed now to the truth. "Oui, madame. J'y étais analyste senior, spécialisé dans la politique monétaire européenne et les accords commerciaux transfrontaliers." "Yes, ma'am. I was a senior analyst, specializing in European monetary policy and cross-border trade agreements." The 3 French investors were staring at her with open fascination. Alexander looked like he might have a stroke. Pierre gestured to an empty chair. "S'il vous plaît, asseyez-vous. J'aimerais beaucoup parler avec vous." "Please, sit down. I would very much like to speak with you." Emma glanced at Alexander, who seemed incapable of speech. In his eyes, she could see the calculation happening, the realization that this waitress he'd spent the entire evening looking down on might somehow be the key to saving his collapsing deal. Finally, he managed to speak, his voice tight. "Emma, if you could assist us with some translation." But Pierre waved him off. "No, no. I want to hear from Mademoiselle. I'm sorry, I don't know your name." "Rodriguez. Emma Rodriguez." "Mademoiselle Rodriguez, tell me, you understand European markets? You worked on trade policy?" And Emma, seeing the desperation in Alexander's eyes, the same desperation she felt every time she looked at her mother's medical bills, made a decision. She sat down at the table, and in flawless French, she began to speak. She addressed every concern the consortium had raised. She explained the contract terms they'd been questioning, drawing on her years at the IMF and her deep understanding of international trade law. She discussed cultural nuances in American versus European business practices, bridging the gap that Alexander's language limitations had created. She spoke about market opportunities in major American cities, citing specific demographic data and economic projections that she pulled from memory, numbers and statistics she'd internalized during her years analyzing exactly these kinds of cross-border investments. For 45 minutes, Emma Rodriguez transformed from an invisible waitress into a brilliant economic mind. She answered questions that Alexander couldn't even understand, let alone respond to. She charmed Pierre with references to French literature and contemporary Paris culture. She impressed Jean with her grasp of European Union trade regulations. She won over Marie by discussing the challenges and opportunities of gender equity in corporate leadership, drawing parallels between European and American business environments. Alexander sat in his chair, watching this transformation with a mixture of shock, shame, and grudging admiration. Every word Emma spoke in perfect French was another nail in the coffin of his arrogance. Every insight she offered was proof of his own limitations. The waitress he'd mocked, the woman he'd looked at with contempt, was saving the biggest deal of his career, and she was doing it in a language he barely spoke, with a level of expertise he couldn't hope to match. By the time Emma finished speaking, Pierre was beaming. "Monsieur Stone," he said, switching back to English, "you are full of surprises. I had my doubts about expanding to America, but if your organization has people like Mademoiselle Rodriguez, people who truly understand both cultures, both markets, this changes everything." Alexander forced himself to smile, to nod, to play along as if this had all been part of his plan. "Yes, Emma is. She's one of our most valuable team members." "Very valuable." Emma met his eyes across the table, and in that look was everything that had gone unsaid all evening. She knew he'd been about to fire her. He knew she'd just saved him from catastrophic failure, and they both knew that nothing between them would ever be the same. The consortium stayed for another hour, discussing details that Emma helped translate and clarify. By the time they left, near midnight, they'd verbally agreed to move forward with the deal. They wanted Emma present at all future negotiations as a cultural liaison and economic consultant. "She understands both our worlds," Pierre said as Alexander walked them to their car. "That is rare and precious. Take care of her, Monsieur Stone." After they departed, Alexander stood in the empty restaurant with Marcus and Emma. The last customers had long since left. The kitchen staff was cleaning up. The silence was deafening. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice carefully neutral. "Why didn't you tell me you spoke French, that you had that background?" Emma looked at him with those calm, steady eyes that suddenly seemed to contain depths he'd never bothered to notice. "You never asked. You looked at me and saw a waitress with an accent. You assumed that's all I was. You made up your mind about my worth based on how I looked and how I sounded. But you were deliberately acting like someone whose first language wasn't English?" Emma's voice remained even, but there was steel beneath the surface. "I speak 6 languages, Mr. Stone. English is actually my best one, aside from Spanish. But I've learned that when you're a woman, when you're Hispanic, when you need a job quickly and can't afford to wait through lengthy interview processes, sometimes it's easier to be what people expect you to be. You don't ask questions of the help. You don't probe too deeply. You just need warm bodies to carry plates and refill water glasses." Alexander felt something uncomfortable twisting in his gut. Shame. An emotion he didn't experience often and didn't enjoy. "You have a PhD from Harvard. You worked at the International Monetary Fund. Why are you serving tables?" Emma's expression flickered, just for a moment, and Alexander saw beneath her composed exterior to the exhaustion and grief she carried. "My mother has stage 4 cancer. The treatment isn't covered by insurance. I needed money quickly, and I needed flexible hours so I could take her to appointments. Stone's pays well. The tips are excellent. And no one asks questions about overqualified waitresses as long as they show up on time and don't steal from the register." The words hung in the air between them. Alexander thought about his $3.7 billion net worth, about the gold flatware and the crystal chandeliers, about how he'd mocked this woman for struggling with a tray of champagne while she was working 3 jobs to save her dying mother. "How much do you need?" he asked quietly. Emma's spine stiffened. "I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Stone. I saved your deal tonight, but I did it for the tips, for my job security, not because I expected some kind of reward." "That wasn't—" Alexander stopped, reconsidered. "The consortium wants you at the negotiations. They won't move forward without you. That means you're no longer just a waitress. I need you as a business consultant. This deal is worth $200 million. Your involvement is worth, what would you say, standard consulting rates for someone with your credentials? Emma studied him carefully, trying to determine if this was genuine or some kind of trap. Standard consulting rates for someone with my background and the stakes involved would be around $500 per hour, but I'm not in a position to negotiate. $1,000 per hour. Alexander cut her off. The negotiations will take approximately 300 hours over the next 6 months. That's $300,000 minus taxes. Will that cover your mother's treatment? Emma felt the world tilt beneath her feet. $300,000. The exact amount she needed, the impossible sum that had kept her awake every night for 3 months. She could feel tears threatening, but she fought them back. Why would you do this? Alexander looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since she'd walked into his restaurant. Because I was wrong about you. Completely, utterly wrong. And because you just saved my entire European expansion. And because, he paused, that uncomfortable shame twisting deeper, because I've spent the last 6 hours treating you like you were worthless. And you turned out to be worth more than anyone else in this building. Including me. Emma was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I don't want charity. I'll do the work. I'll earn every dollar. But I need a contract in writing, Mr. Stone. Forgive me for not taking the word of someone who spent all evening looking at me like I was dirt on his shoe. Alexander winced but nodded. Fair enough. Come to my office Monday morning. We'll draw up a formal consulting contract. And Emma? She looked at him, waiting. I'm sorry. For tonight. For assuming. For all of it. You deserved better. Emma held his gaze. Yes, I did. But apologies don't pay medical bills, Mr. Stone. Let's see if you can turn those words into actions. She collected her purse from the staff room and walked out of Stone's restaurant into the cool September night. Behind her, Alexander Stone stood in his empty empire of gold and crystal, feeling for the first time in 20 years that maybe, just maybe, he didn't know anything at all about worth or value or what really mattered in this world. The next 6 months changed everything. Emma worked closely with Alexander and his team, managing every aspect of the European expansion deal. Her fluency in French, her deep understanding of international economics, and her natural diplomatic skills made the negotiations smoother than Alexander had dared to hope. Pierre Dubois and his consortium were so impressed with her work that they insisted on adding a clause to the contract, ensuring Emma would remain involved in the European operations for at least 3 years after the deal closed. But something else was changing, too. Something Alexander hadn't anticipated. The more time he spent with Emma, the more he saw past his initial prejudices, the more he realized how profoundly wrong he'd been. Not just about her, but about so many things. Emma didn't just speak 6 languages. She thought in 6 different cultural frameworks. She could explain complex economic concepts in ways that made them accessible and clear. She had a sharp wit that occasionally cut through his corporate speak with observations that were both funny and uncomfortably accurate. During one particularly long meeting in late October, after they'd been working together for about 6 weeks, Alexander made a comment about the simple preferences of European diners versus Americans. Emma had looked at him over her laptop and said dryly, You know, for someone who runs 15 restaurants, you have a surprisingly reductive view of how people eat. There's nothing simple about cultural food preferences. They're wrapped up in centuries of history, trade patterns, agricultural practices, and social signaling. But sure, let's call it simple. Marcus, who was also in the meeting, had nearly choked on his coffee trying not to laugh. Alexander had felt his face flush. But then he'd laughed too. Because she was right. And because someone finally felt comfortable enough to call him out on his bullshit. They fell into a routine, early morning meetings before Stone's opened for lunch service. Strategy sessions over coffee that Emma always insisted on paying for, despite Alexander's protests. Late-night phone calls when Pierre would send urgent questions from Paris, 7 hours ahead. Gradually, Emma stopped working the floor at Stone's. She still came to the restaurant most days, but now she had an office in the building, a proper workspace with a computer and a phone line, and everything she needed to manage the European expansion project. Alexander insisted on paying her the full consulting rate from day one, even before the contract was officially signed. When his lawyers questioned the expenditure, he'd shut them down with a coldness that surprised even him. She's worth every penny. Pay her. Emma's mother, Rosa, started her experimental treatment in early October. The first round went better than expected, and while the doctors cautioned against optimism, Emma allowed herself to feel hope for the first time in months. She cut back to just 2 jobs, the consulting work with Alexander and her online teaching. The tutoring gig ended. She started sleeping more than 4 hours a night. The shadows under her eyes began to fade. One November evening, after a particularly productive meeting, Alexander invited Emma to stay for dinner at Stone's, not as staff, but as his guest. Emma hesitated, old instincts warning her about mixing professional and personal boundaries. But she was curious, too. What would it be like to sit in the dining room she'd served, to be on the other side of that invisible wall between servers and served? The meal was extraordinary, of course. Every course was a masterwork of culinary art. But what surprised Emma was how nervous Alexander seemed. He kept adjusting his napkin, checking his phone, asking if the temperature was comfortable, if she liked the wine selection. "You know I've served this exact meal about 100 times, right?" Emma said, amused. "I know what it tastes like." Alexander laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his usually stern face into something younger, more open. "I know, I wanted you to experience it properly, as it's meant to be experienced, not rushing from table to table, not worrying about tips or difficult customers. Just the food and the atmosphere and—" He stopped, seeming embarrassed. Emma looked at him thoughtfully. "You're trying to make up for that first night, when you looked at me like I was nothing." "Yes," Alexander admitted quietly. "Though I'm not sure one dinner can make up for that." "It can't," Emma agreed. "But it's a start." They talked through multiple courses, and Alexander found himself telling Emma things he rarely shared with anyone. About growing up poor in Detroit, the son of a factory worker who drank too much and a mother who cleaned houses to make ends meet. About his obsession with fine dining, how he'd discovered it through a scholarship program that took inner-city kids to fancy restaurants once a month. How the first time he'd eaten in a place like Stone's, he'd felt so out of place, so judged by the staff and the other diners, that he'd sworn to himself he'd never feel like that again. "So you built this," Emma gestured to the elegant space around them, "to prove you belonged. And I became exactly like the people who'd made me feel worthless," Alexander said bitterly. "I became the one doing the judging, looking down at anyone who didn't fit my picture of what success looked like, what sophistication looked like. I became what I hated." Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We all do that, I think. Internalize the judgments we've experienced and turn them outward on others. The question is whether we're willing to recognize it and change." "Is that what you did?" Alexander asked. "Your broken English act. That was about protecting yourself from judgment." Emma nodded slowly. "When you're an immigrant, especially a Latina immigrant, people make assumptions. If I'd walked into Stone's 3 months ago and told Marcus I had a PhD from Harvard, he would have thought I was lying or crazy, maybe both. It's easier to let people underestimate you. Lower expectations, fewer questions." "But you're brilliant," Alexander protested. "You shouldn't have to hide that." "Should is a funny word," Emma replied. "What should be and what is are very different things. You should have looked past my accent and seen my competence. But you didn't. Most people don't. So I adapt. I survive. I do what I need to do to take care of my mother and pay the bills. Dignity is a luxury I couldn't afford 3 months ago." Alexander felt that shame again, sharper this time. You can afford it now. The consulting fees are professional compensation for professional work, Emma interrupted firmly. I've earned every dollar I've made, Mr. Stone. I'm not going to apologize for that or diminish it by pretending it's some kind of charity or reparation for your guilty conscience. I wasn't suggesting— Alexander stopped, frustrated with himself. I'm handling this badly. Emma's expression softened slightly. You're trying. That's more than most people do. They finished dinner in a more comfortable silence. As Emma prepared to leave, Alexander walked her to the entrance. Could we do this again? He asked. Dinner? As colleagues celebrating a successful project? Emma studied him for a long moment. Is that all this is? Colleagues? Alexander met her eyes. I don't know, but I'd like to find out, if you're willing. Emma surprised herself by nodding. One step at a time, Mr. Stone. Let's see if you can keep treating me like an equal when there's not a $200 million deal on the line. As winter settled over the city, Alexander found himself thinking about Emma constantly. The way she switched effortlessly between languages during conference calls. Her laugh when something genuinely amused her, which was rarer than he'd like but all the more precious for it. The fierce love in her voice when she talked about her mother, who was responding well to treatment. They had dinner several more times, always at Stone's, always with the excuse of discussing business. But the conversations wandered far from work. They discussed books, politics, travel. Emma told him about her time in Paris, in Beijing, in Milan. Alexander told her about his failed marriage 10 years ago, how his ex-wife had finally left after accusing him of loving his restaurants more than he'd ever loved her. She wasn't wrong, Alexander admitted. I didn't know how to love anything that I couldn't control or perfect or turn into a success metric. And now? Emma asked. Now I'm trying to learn. You're teaching me, whether you mean to or not. Emma shook her head, smiling. I'm not teaching you anything. I'm just being myself. If that's revelatory to you, that says more about your previous limitations than my teaching skills. There you go again, Alexander said, grinning, cutting through my nonsense. Someone has to, Emma replied. Your staff are too scared of you, and your business partners want your money too much to be honest. I, on the other hand, have already seen you at your worst. What else do I have to lose? By December, when the European deal officially closed, Alexander realized something that both terrified and exhilarated him. He was falling in love with Emma Rodriguez. Not because she'd saved his deal, though that certainly didn't hurt. Not because she was brilliant, though she was. But because she saw him clearly, all his flaws and prejudices and mistakes, and she still gave him a chance to be better. She challenged him. She called him out when he reverted to his old judgmental patterns. She made him laugh. She made him think about things he'd never considered. She made him want to be worthy of her respect. The problem was, he had no idea if she felt the same way. Emma was professional, friendly, occasionally warm, but always maintained clear boundaries. She never let him pay for her coffee. She never accepted gifts beyond what was appropriate for a business relationship. When he'd tried to offer her a permanent position with a substantial salary and equity in the European expansion, she'd politely declined. I'm going back to the IMF, she'd said. Once my mother's treatment is complete, and I know she's stable, this was always temporary for me, a means to an end. But you could do so much here, Alexander had protested. You've built relationships with the European partners. They trust you. We could expand beyond restaurants, get into hospitality, real estate development. Alexander, Emma had said, using his first name for one of the few times since they'd started working together. I appreciate what you're offering, but that's your dream, not mine. My dream is international policy work, helping shape economic decisions that affect millions of people. I miss that work. I'm grateful for this opportunity, but it was never meant to be permanent. That conversation had happened 2 weeks ago, and Alexander had been spiraling ever since. He'd realized, too late as always, that he'd fallen in love with someone who was going to leave, someone whose life and ambitions existed completely independent of him and his empire, someone who didn't need him at all. It was Christmas Eve, and Stone's was closed for one of only 3 days all year. Alexander had invited Emma to a private dinner, just the two of them, in the empty restaurant. She'd agreed, though with some hesitation. The space looked magical, decorated with thousands of white lights and pine branches that filled the air with evergreen scent. Alexander had cooked the meal himself, something he rarely did anymore but had once loved. As they sat at a table near the window, looking out at the snow beginning to fall on the city streets, Alexander finally found the courage to speak the truth. "I've been an idiot," he began. Emma looked up from her wine glass, eyebrows raised. "That's a broad statement. Could you be more specific?" Despite his nervousness, Alexander smiled. "About you, about us, about everything." He took a deep breath. When you walked into my restaurant 3 months ago, I saw someone I thought was beneath me, someone who didn't belong in my perfect world, and I was wrong about every single thing. You weren't beneath me. I was beneath you, your intelligence, your compassion, your strength, your grace under impossible pressure. You were serving tables to save your mother's life while I was worrying about crystal chandeliers and gold flatware. You were juggling 3 jobs and a dying parent while I was throwing tantrums about imperfect staff. You speak 6 languages and have degrees I can't even pronounce while I barely graduated college because I was too busy working restaurant jobs to pay tuition. Emma was very still, watching him with those steady eyes that saw everything. "These past 3 months," Alexander continued, "have taught me more than the previous 20 years. You've shown me that worth has nothing to do with wealth, that intelligence comes in forms I never bothered to recognize, that the people I dismissed as invisible were actually the most extraordinary people in the room. You saved my business deal, yes, but more than that, you saved me from becoming permanently stuck as the arrogant, small-minded man who mocked a waitress for speaking broken English." He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close. "I'm in love with you, Emma. I know I have no right to be. I know you're leaving, going back to your real life, your important work. I know I'll probably never be worthy of you. But I needed you to know. Before you go, I needed you to know that you changed me, that you made me better, that these 3 months with you have been the best of my life, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful that you walked into my restaurant when you did." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Emma's eyes had filled with tears, though she didn't let them fall. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "You're right that you were wrong about me, about so many things. But you're wrong about something else, too." Alexander's heart sank. Of course, he'd been a fool to hope. "You're wrong that you'll never be worthy," Emma continued. "The man who mocked me that first night wasn't worthy. But the man who apologized, who offered me real work for real pay, who has spent 3 months actively trying to change his perspectives and challenge his prejudices. That man is getting there." She did reach across the table then, taking his hand. "I don't love you yet, Alexander. I won't lie about that. Trust takes time, and you hurt me deeply that first night. You made me feel small and worthless. And that's not something I can just forget. But I like you. I respect you. And I see the effort you're making. That matters. But you're still leaving," Alexander said, trying to keep the despair out of his voice. Emma nodded. "My mother's treatment is going well. If the scans in February are clear, I'll be able to return to D.C. by March." "That was always the plan. Would you consider staying?" Alexander asked. "Not for me, necessarily, but Stone's European expansion will need someone for the next few years. Someone who understands both markets. It could be you." Emma smiled sadly. "You're asking me to give up work I love, work that matters to me deeply, to stay here and help you build a restaurant empire? Do you see the problem with that request?" Alexander closed his eyes. Yes. God, yes. I'm doing it again. Putting my needs, my priorities, my vision above yours. I'm sorry. But, Emma said softly, and Alexander's eyes snapped open. D.C. is only 3 hours from New York. I don't think distance has to mean the end of everything. If you're willing to put in the work, real work, not grand gestures or expensive gifts, but actual effort to understand me, to support my career, to see me as an equal partner in whatever this might become. Alexander felt hope flooding back into his chest. I can do that. I want to do that. I want to know everything about you, Emma, your work, your dreams, your favorite books, your mother's stories, what makes you laugh, what keeps you up at night, all of it. Emma squeezed his hand. Then let's start with dinner, and talking, and seeing where this goes. No promises, no pressure, just two people who met under the worst possible circumstances, trying to find out if there's something real underneath all the mistakes and misunderstandings. They talked until nearly dawn, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Alexander told Emma about his childhood poverty, the shame that had driven him to build an empire of expensive restaurants. Emma told him about her father's death, her mother's strength, the weight of being the first in her family to go to college. As the winter sun began to rise over the city, painting the snow-covered streets in shades of pink and gold, Emma leaned across the table and kissed Alexander softly. It was brief, gentle, full of possibility, but no guarantees. "Thank you," she said, "for the apology, for changing, for seeing me." "Thank you," Alexander replied, "for giving me a second chance I absolutely didn't deserve." The next 6 months were not easy. Emma returned to DFC in March, resuming her position at the IMF with enthusiasm and relief. Her mother's cancer went into remission, allowing Emma to finally breathe after a year of holding her breath against disaster. Alexander visited D.C. every other weekend. Emma came to New York when she could. They talked on the phone every night, sometimes for hours, sometimes for just a few minutes before sleep. They learned each other's rhythms and routines. They argued about politics, about economic policy, about the ethics of wealth and privilege. Emma never let Alexander hide behind easy answers or comfortable assumptions. She pushed him, challenged him, made him defend positions he'd never questioned before. And Alexander loved her for it. At Stone's, changes began to happen. Alexander implemented new hiring practices, focusing on skills and experience rather than appearance or accent. He started a program to hire and train refugees and immigrants, offering language support and flexible hours. When Marcus questioned the policy, worried about maintaining standards, Alexander had looked him dead in the eye and said, "Our standards were wrong. We're changing them." He promoted based on merit rather than tenure. He learned basic phrases in Spanish, French, and Italian to communicate better with his diverse staff. He started paying closer attention to the people who made his restaurants run, seeing them as individuals rather than interchangeable parts in his perfect machine. Emma's influence spread throughout his entire organization. The staff noticed. They responded. Turnover decreased. Employee satisfaction increased. And somehow, mysteriously, the quality of service got better, not worse. Because people who felt respected and valued worked harder, cared more, took pride in what they did. By summer, Alexander and Emma's relationship had deepened into something real and lasting. They weren't perfect. They still argued, still had moments of misunderstanding. Emma sometimes got frustrated with Alexander's workaholic tendencies. Alexander sometimes struggled with Emma's frequent travel for work. But they communicated. They compromised. They showed up for each other, again and again. In August, Emma's mother Rosa met Alexander for the first time. They had dinner at a small restaurant in DRC, nothing fancy, just good food and honest conversation. Rosa, sharp-eyed and warm despite what her body had been through, studied Alexander carefully throughout the meal. At the end of the evening, As Alexander was helping Emma clean up, Rosa pulled him aside. "My daughter is the strongest person I know," she said in Spanish, which Emma had taught Alexander over the past months. "She has survived things that would have broken lesser people. Do not be the thing that breaks her. Do not take her strength for granted or assume she will always bend to accommodate you." Alexander nodded seriously. "I understand. I promise you, I see her strength. I respect it, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of it." Rosa smiled then and patted his cheek. "Good answer. Now, when are you going to propose?" Emma, overhearing from the kitchen, called out in mortified Spanish. "Mommy, stop interrogating him." But Alexander just laughed, and Rosa winked at him, and he felt for the first time like he might actually belong in this family he desperately wanted to be part of. He didn't propose that night, or the next month. He waited until September, by exactly 1 year after Emma had walked into Stone's restaurant. He took her back to that same restaurant, to that same table where she'd once served champagne while fighting exhaustion and grief and her dying mother's medical bills. He'd cleared the entire restaurant, just the two of them in that space that had witnessed both his worst behavior and his tentative steps toward becoming better. "A year ago," he said, taking her hands across the table, "you walked into this restaurant and I saw only what I wanted to see. A waitress with broken English who didn't meet my standards. I was blind, arrogant, and cruel, but you saw me clearly. Even then, you saw past my wealth and my restaurants to the insecure, judgmental man underneath, and somehow, impossibly, you gave me a chance to change." He pulled out a small box, opening it to reveal a simple ring, elegant but not ostentatious. "I'm not asking you to change for me. I'm not asking you to give up your career or your dreams or any part of who you are. I'm asking if you'll let me spend the rest of my life learning from you, being challenged by you, supporting your work and your goals the way you've supported mine, being part of your life the way I hope you'll be part of mine." Emma's eyes filled with tears, and this time she let them fall. That was a pretty good speech for someone who claimed he wasn't eloquent. "I've been practicing for 2 months, Alexander admitted. "Emma Rodriguez, will you marry me?" Emma looked at the ring, at Alexander, at the restaurant where they'd met. She thought about that first night, the humiliation and anger she'd felt, the cruel laughter of wealthy diners, the contempt in Alexander's eyes. She thought about how far he'd come, the real changes he'd made, not just in words but in actions. The way he now greeted every staff member by name, the refugee hiring program, the way he'd supported her career without resentment, celebrated her successes without jealousy. She thought about her mother, healthy now, planning a garden for next spring, about the medical bills that were paid, about the second chance both she and Alexander had been given in such different ways. And she thought about love, real love. Not the easy kind built on initial attraction and perfect circumstances, but the harder, deeper kind built on seeing someone's flaws and mistakes and choosing to believe in their capacity for growth. "Yes," she said, "yes, I'll marry you. But I'm keeping my job at the IMF, and you're learning Portuguese next because I want you to talk to my grandmother without me translating, and we're spending every Christmas in San Antonio with my family and—" Alexander was laughing, crying, pulling her up from her chair and kissing her. "Yes, yes to all of it. Whatever you want, however you want it, just say you'll be with me." "I'm with you," Emma whispered against his lips. "I've been with you since the moment you apologized and actually meant it. Since you offered me real work instead of charity, since you started treating your staff like human beings instead of props in your perfect restaurant. I'm with you." They married the following spring in a small ceremony that mixed both families and cultures. Rosa, healthy and radiant, cried through the entire service. Alexander's mother, who he'd been estranged from for years, attended and told Emma she'd never seen her son so happy, so humble, so human. The reception was held at Stone's, of course, but it was different now. The staff, many of whom Emma had trained or helped hire, served with pride rather than fear. The menu reflected both Emma's Mexican heritage and Alexander's Detroit roots alongside the French cuisine the restaurant was famous for. Speeches were given in 3 languages. During his toast, Pierre Dubois, now a close friend, raised his glass and said with a smile, "To the waitress who spoke perfect French and saved not just a business deal, but apparently a man's entire soul. To Emma." The crowd erupted in cheers. Emma laughed and cried and held Alexander's hand, marveling at how a single moment, a single choice to respond in French instead of broken English, had changed the trajectory of both their lives. She thought about the person she'd been a year ago, desperate, exhausted, willing to diminish herself just to survive. She thought about the person Alexander had been, arrogant, blind, measuring worth in dollars and appearances, and she thought about who they were now, together, better, not perfect, never perfect, but trying every day to see clearly, to choose kindness, to recognize worth in all its forms. Years later, Emma would become the youngest director in IMF history. Alexander would expand his restaurant empire across Europe, always with Emma's guidance and insight. They would have 2 children who grew up bilingual, learning early that intelligence and worth came in many languages, many forms, many unexpected packages. But neither of them ever forgot that September night. The night an arrogant billionaire mocked a waitress for speaking broken English. The night a brilliant woman said something in perfect French that shattered a man's assumptions and his arrogance and his entire worldview. The night that proved what Emma had always known, that the people we underestimate are sometimes the most extraordinary people in the room. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, they're willing to give us a second chance we absolutely don't deserve. Alexander Stone never forgot the lesson Emma Rodriguez taught him that night, and Emma Rodriguez never forgot that even the most arrogant people can change if they're willing to look beyond their own limited vision and see the truth that's been standing in front of them all along. This is their story, a story about prejudice and redemption, about hidden worth and unexpected love, about the day a waitress spoke perfect French and changed everything. And if this story has taught you anything, if you believe that worth has nothing to do with wealth or accent or appearance, that the people we dismiss might be the most brilliant people we'll ever meet, that it's never too late to recognize our mistakes and choose to be better, then make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment and let us know. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever underestimated someone and learned you were wrong? Rate this story from 0 to 10 and let us know what you think. Thank you for being part of the Deep Stories community. Until next time, remember, the most important things in life are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to finally open our eyes and see.